Welcome to our Mitchell Center Sustainability Talk Series. My name is David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center. It's great to have you with us. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Lauri Gorton. Lauri is the program manager for Greenfield Penobscot Estuary Remediation Trust, LLC. She has been working for a long time on a variety of projects to remediate environmental contamination. After she got her Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering, so we have some students from that kind of program right here. And by the way, I was a postdoctoral fellow at the same institution where she worked, Michigan State University, so those Spartans. She began leading after that with a bachelor's degree, began leading a lot of complex initiatives focused on hazardous waste site remediation and redevelopment, kind of brownfields work, right? Which always involve a lot of regulatory challenges, as well as really important public outreach. So I think we're going to hear about all those different facets of this work. Now, if you don't know much about this story, it goes way back more than half a century when Mercury was discharged into the Penobscot River a short distance downstream in Orrington. And there's a very important role. I don't know if Lauri, how much she knows about it, but you Maine researchers played in this work for years. Diane Kopek, Arya Amirbaman, who was in engineering at the time, and their colleagues documented the causes and consequences of mercury contamination, which turned out to be essential for the ultimate court decision requiring remediation of the estuary. So I have a lot of conversations with faculty and students that ask themselves whether their research is making a difference. How is it making a difference? And in this case, that research made an enormous difference. In fact, it's not clear whether there would be a remediation project had it not been for that team of researchers trying to nail down exactly what happened in this amazing river system. But that's also a very complicated story, and the remediation itself has only just begun, which is why I'm delighted that Lauri can tell us the whole story. Please join me in welcoming her via Zoom from, I think, Milwaukee to our Sustainability Talk series.
Yeah. Thank you, David, very much. I appreciate that. I'm going to go camera on so that I can say hello to everybody. I'm sorry that I'm not there with you all, but I really appreciate the opportunity and I'm excited to talk about the work that we're doing. David's, thank you for the introduction. You made the start of my discussion today just a little bit easier because it gives me something to feather right into. So let me turn the camera off here. And I'm going to get started. You know, it's a challenge to summarize almost 25 years of work regarding the remediation and restoration of the estuary in anything less than a few hours. So please consider today an introduction. What I'd like to do is start with some background information on mercury in Maine and the environment, and then also the events, some of which David's just alluded to, leading up to the consent decree itself. I'll provide an overview of the consent decree and why it's important to the cleanup work, talk about some of our cleanup plans and progress, and then leave plenty of time for questions and discussions. So mercury is a naturally occurring element. It's present in small amounts in the environment naturally, but most of the mercury that we find, and certainly what we're talking about today, has been discharged over time by industry in air emissions or directly to rivers and streams. And it's considered a persistent contaminant because it doesn't break down easily in the environment. And when it does break down, it breaks down to a more highly toxic form of methyl mercury. So I did some of the research that we did in coming into the project, and I went out to the website that you see down there, the maine.gov for mercury information, I was surprised to see that mercury levels in Maine fish, loons, and eagles are among some of the highest in North America. There's been a statewide advisory on fish consumption in place for a while because of the elevated mercury levels. And the Department of Marine Resources in 2014 and then in 2016 expanded it, actually put closure in place for the lower portion of the Penobscot River Estuary to lobster and crabs. So that fishing is no longer permitted by the state. So mercury was discharged from the former Holtrachem facility that used mercury in their industrial process. And the processes, like many industries do, is discharged directly to the river. And studies estimated that the facility discharged between 6 and 12 metric tons of mercury in between the late 1960s and the early 1970s. So mercury binds to sediment, and when the mercury was in the sediment, the river then distributed the contaminated sediment down throughout the estuary. And for those of you who don't know, when we talk about the estuary, that's the portion of the Penobscot River that is tidally influenced, and that becomes very important to the work that we're doing here. The figure that you see on the left shows the concentrations of mercury that have been detected between Orrington and up at the north, where you can just see at the top the location of the former Holtrachem facility, and Penobscot Bay. The colors there represent elevated concentrations, with red being the highest and then orange and yellow. So that just gives you a feel for how far the river has taken the mercury that was discharged originally from the Holtrachem facility. Once the mercury gets into the sediment, the invertebrates, or the worms and the other organisms that live in the sediment and eat in the sediment, start to pick up the mercury. And we consider them to be the bottom of the food chain, if you will. And when the fish and the birds eat the organisms that are in the sediment, they also pick up mercury, and it builds up in their system, or what we call bioaccumulates in the system. And then when predators like eagles and then people eat those fish and birds, that mercury continues to make its way up the food chain, and the predators are also exposed. You'll hear me talk about, as we go forward here, more the invertebrates, polychaetes. They're worms. They're the creatures that live in the sediment, and we also refer to those as the benthic community. So as David mentioned, this timeline has gone on for quite a while, with the original discharge occurring late 60s, early 70s. And then in the year 2000, the Maine People's Alliance and the Natural Resource Defense Council sued Mallinckrodt, the company that was responsible at that time for the former Holtrachem facility, in federal court. And the court appointed scientific panels, and yes, Diane Kopek and several of the Maine researchers were part of those two panels to complete a two-phase study that was very important. I think that the overall goals of the study were to evaluate the extent of mercury in the sediment throughout the estuary, and then also to understand the effects and the presence of mercury in the biota, in the birds and in the fish. That work was done between 2005 and 2013. And then that was the basis for, in 2016 through 2018, the court at that point appointed engineers to identify some of the potential remedial or cleanup actions that could be taken to address the results of the two scientific studies in the mercury contaminated sediment within the estuary. After that third phase engineering study was done, the parties to the lawsuit, Mallinckrodt, Maine People's Alliance, and Natural Resource Defense Council, filed a proposed consent decree to settle the litigation. And in October of 2022, the court approved that consent decree. So I think some of the most important conclusions that the scientific and engineering study came up with was confirmation that mercury was elevated throughout the estuary in sediments and in some birds and fish. One of the other conclusions that came about as a result of all of the studies was that natural recovery of the estuary is very slow. And there are several reasons for that. One being that mercury does stay in the environment as a persistent contaminant, but also because the action of the tides essentially traps a lot of that mercury contaminated sediment within the estuary. Salt water is heavier than fresh water, and with all the contaminated sediment, of course, being at the bottom of the river, when the tide comes in, it effectively traps or even pushes some of the contaminated sediment back upstream and throughout the estuary. The studies that were done during those three phases estimate that it could take anywhere from 50 to 100 years for the estuary to recover on its own, due in large part to that tidal action. And then the conclusions of the engineering study were that there are proven remedies for sediment remediation. There are options that could be applied in the Penobscot Estuary to help accelerate the recovery. Capping, placing a clean material over the top of contaminated sediments, a removal action, dredging sediments, and then also just a number of other things that generally are referred to as enhanced natural recovery. So the consent decree is really the framework for the cleanup itself. The consent decree provided and required Mallinckrodt to provide a total of $187 million for implementation of the remedies, for monitoring, for beneficial projects in terms of committed funds, with an additional $80 million in potential contingent funds for a total funding of $267 million. The consent decree specifies remedies in some cases with the overall intent to reduce exposure to mercury and to help accelerate the recovery of the estuary itself. And the consent decree also created two independent trusts. So there's the Remediation Trust that I'm the program manager for, that's responsible for implementing the cleanup work. And then what we refer to as the Beneficial Projects Trust, the Beneficial Environmental Projects Trust, that is a separate trust. And the parties to the lawsuit, the Natural Resource Defense Council, Maine People's Alliance, and Mallinckrodt, are the named beneficiaries of the consent decree. But one of the things that's really important, and it was very clearly important to the court, was that the larger beneficiaries of this work are the public, the citizens of Maine and the Penobscot River Estuary itself. And the court indicated, and it is in the consent decree, that as a trustee, it's our job to make sure that the interests of the river, the flora, the fauna, and the people who enjoy the river are paramount in our decision process. So the consent decree identifies the site for the purposes of our work as the tidal portions in the estuary, from about the location of the former VZ Dam, which is a little bit upstream of the former Holtrachem facility, as you can see in the map on the left, and then all the way down to Upper Penobscot Bay. So the Remediation Trust is an independent trustee. And as I mentioned, we're responsible for overseeing, managing, and performing the work that's required by the consent decree. And that's everything from the investigation planning, managing the trust funds, doing the investigations, the permitting, the community outreach, and ultimately implementing the cleanup. Greenfield has over 35 years of experience serving as a court-approved environmental and custodial trustee, and we've done work throughout the country for very complex environmental cleanups in a variety of locations. So again, the overall intent of the remedies specified in the consent decree are to reduce exposure to mercury and accelerate recovery. The consent decree recognized that the Penobscot River is a very dynamic and powerful system. It has a complicated ecosystem, and the funds that are provided within the consent decree, although they're very significant, are not enough to completely clean up the estuary. So our focus is to take the money that's provided and put it to best use, create the best environmental benefit that we can, and focusing on these two things, reducing exposure to mercury and then accelerating the recovery. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the remedies that are provided in the consent decree itself. The first one being for Orrington Reach. So as you can see in the map on the left, Orrington Reach is the portion of the estuary between Orrington and North Bucksport. And the remedy that was specified in the consent decree was to cap approximately 130 acres of intertidal flats in Orrington Reach. The intertidal flats shown in the photograph on the right are the portions of the river that are exposed when the tide goes out. And then the consent decree also provided another $10 million in contingent funding if we were not able to cap the 130 acres for the $50 million that was provided. The Remediation Trust is proposing putting a thin layer cap or a TLC in Orrington Reach. Thin layer caps are often referred to as enhanced natural recovery because they augment the river's natural process of depositing sediment over time. And as time goes by, the thin layer cap will actually blend in with the natural sediment features. So what you see here in this cartoon essentially is a cutaway of the 4 to 6 inch sand cap that we're proposing to put on top of the contaminated sediment in the flats. And that 4 to 6 inches is determined by what we refer to as the biologically active zone. Basically, that's the portion of the upper portion of the sediment where the benthic organisms, the worms, and the organisms live. So we did studies to determine that the 4 to 6 inches was the typical depth of the biologically active zone for the flats that we're looking at. And the sand cap would then be put on top of it. And what happens is once the sand goes on, the benthic organisms that do live in that surface layer tend to be deprived of food and oxygen, and their population will reduce and go away. But over time, as the river deposits new sediment on top of the cap, it also deposits new organisms. And what we see in other places is that those the organisms will recover, that benthic community, if you will recover over time sometimes within 12 to 18 months. So we're proposing a pilot test. You know, caps have been used successfully in many other places to address contaminated sediment, but the pilot that we're proposing is a small scale test to confirm that what's worked in other places is going to work well in the Penobscot. So we're proposing putting a pilot cap on about a little over 6 acres in East Cove 3. So on the inset there, you see East Cove 3 is just downstream from the former Holtrachem facility. And the tan area that's here in the middle is about the 6.3 acres that we're going to put down a cap. We're going to put a 6-inch thick cap on the northern part and a 4-inch thick cap on the southern part so that we can evaluate whether there's a difference in performance. And that'll be clean sand that's locally sourced from pits in the area. And what you see at the bottom is a cross section of, actually, it's an actual cross section of East Cove 3. You can see the rocky shoreline, the intertidal portion of the flats, and then that very thin layer of sand that would be put on that intertidal portion between the mean high water and the mean low water marks. And then the cap would be monitored for a period of 2 to 5 years. And we'd like to evaluate the performance of the cap. So we will sample the sand to see if the mercury concentrations remain low, as we expect that they will, because it was clean sand that was put down. And we also want to evaluate whether or not the cap is stable. In other words, is it going to erode if there are big storms? And also one of the big questions that we have is whether or not the ice flows that are present. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with what the river looks like and did look like this winter, but after the Coast Guard icebreakers go through, there are sometimes pretty massive blocks of ice that will be deposited on the caps, on the coves for a period of time, and they can move around, and we want to see whether or not the ice has an effect on the cap staying in place or if it's going to be damaged. And then we also want to monitor, of course, to evaluate the effects that the cap might have on the benthic organisms in the sediment, as well as the low marsh and the intertidal flats. So we'll be looking essentially at monitoring water quality during construction, again, looking at the benthic community to see whether it is recovering as expected, and then if the fish and birds start to come back to the area and forage or feed in the flats as they did before. You know, we'll look at low marsh vegetation. The studies have shown several areas where marshes have been capped and the vegetation can come up through 6-inch caps, re-emerge just fine. And then we'll also be looking to see whether or not there are any effects on shoreline erosion. The second, the consent decree refers to them as work categories, but essentially the second remedy that is specified in the consent decree is the removal of contaminated sediment, you know, with the goal being to reduce the amount of mercury mass in the estuary as total. So that the consent decree provides $70 million for dredging and then beneficial reuse of the material that's dredged, with another $50 million provided in contingent funds that can be used only if there are not beneficial reuse opportunities and the sediment that was removed would need to be taken to a landfill for disposal. We're just getting started with this part of the cleanup. It's a very complicated action for several reasons. We need to identify the areas that are going to provide us with the most environmental benefit for removal. where can we remove material and have it create the best benefit for the estuary? We need to evaluate the technologies that we'll use to remove the sediment and identify how the material can be dewatered once we remove it. The water would need to be treated. And then, of course, we need to evaluate whether or not that material can be suitable for a beneficial use. If there is a beneficial use available, just as examples of beneficial use in other places, dredged sediments have been used as fill for quarries. It depends, of course, on the nature of the sediments that are being removed, and because the sediment that we have will have mercury contamination in it, it'll have to be sampled and evaluated to determine where, if and when it can be reused protectively as a beneficial reuse. So the two figures that are here, I wanted to just give you an idea. At least you can see the box there is around the lower portion of the estuary, basically below Orrington Reach in the area that's going to be capped. And the inset that has the circles around it with those dark little squiggles are areas where the previous studies had identified there being some fairly significant surface deposits of contaminated sediment. And those areas are not right in the middle of the river, which is good because the middle of the river is deep and the water moves fast. So they're in a place where they would be a little more feasible to remove, but they also are the areas that the studies have identified are the source of some of the mercury contamination that's still being moved around in the estuary. So the third remediation category is for the Orland River and the East Channel around Verona Island. The consent decree provides $30 million for that work category, but it doesn't specify a remedy there. And what you can see here in this Google Earth aerial photograph, so this is Verona Island, the East Channel around Verona Island, and then the Orland River here. Both the channels of both of those areas become very narrow when the tide goes out. And you can see just barely in this photograph that the intertidal flats in these areas are significant. The channel, when the tide goes out, gets down to almost nothing, and it's really, it almost looks like just a few feet across in some places in the Orland River. So with the large amount of intertidal flats in that area, as we get more information from the thin layer cap pilot project that we're doing, and also the evaluations of the removal actions, we'll take that information and we'll look to see how it may apply and what might work best for Orland River. So this removal action will benefit from all the work that's being done on the capping and the mobile sediments removal action. We've done several investigations to help us model river flow and to develop what's called a hydrodynamic model that we can use to design both the capping and the removal remedies. A hydrodynamic model is basically just a model of how the river moves itself, and it allows you to estimate river water velocities and forces, and both of those things are very important in the capping and the removal. So in the spring of 2023, we did a river flow velocity monitoring event where we dropped the platform that you see in the photograph on the left there into the river bottom and left it there for about 3 months in the spring when the river velocity coming downstream is the highest at the spring freshet, to get data on river velocities that we could feed into the model. And we had a little bit of a panic at the end of that exercise because when we went back to retrieve the platform, we couldn't find it. And long story short, it actually took us sending divers down because the river had started to bury the platform with debris and everything from, from some of the storms that had happened later that year. But we got our velocity monitoring data from the platform. Everything was fine. And then the other thing that we did was a bathymetric survey, essentially mapping the bottom of the estuary. And we did both of these things for the entire estuary itself because we want to use the model for everything that we do. And those things were that data was fed into our hydrodynamic model. The figure that you see on the right shows some of the grids of the model. And the colors show, the darkest green shows the area of the river where the water's moving the fastest, with the lighter greens then going down to tan, showing the velocities decreasing. And what that hydrodynamic model allows us to do is estimate the river velocities and forces under a lot of different conditions. So high tides, high storm events and high tides together. And we've used it in the cap design to determine whether or not we need to have armoring on the river edge of the cap, what the forces might be there, if the water itself would erode the cap, for example. And we'll use that information when we design the removal actions to evaluate the feasibility of taking sediment out and being able to somewhat control resuspension if we're digging in an area of the river where the water is moving really quickly. We've also done several field investigations building on the really good work that was done by the two scientific studies, Dr. Kopak and the group, and the engineering study, to update that information. Basically, we went out and we did a coastal wetland assessment to do a preliminary delineation of the marshes that may be present in the intertidal flats. I think you could see from the previous photograph that the flats can be a combination of just mud flat and then have low marsh fringes around it. We did a little bit of sediment pre-design investigation to update our information on the mercury concentrations in the sediment. And one of the things that we found was that the concentrations of mercury were pretty much the same as they were back in, the 2013, 2015, 2016, when the original studies were done. So we don't see the mercury concentrations in the sediment going down significantly on their own. We did a benthic survey to count worms and look at what the benthic populations are of those organisms that live in the sediment. We used a pretty cool technology. It's called sediment profile imaging with a convenient acronym called SPY that basically allows you to push a glass prism down into the sediment and actually see and photograph presence of worms, feeding tubes, and things like that. And that was one of the things that we used to determine how thick that biologically active zone is in the sediment. There are lots of different ways to do it, but that was the one that we chose to use in the pre-design investigation. And then we've also had cove cams in place. The winter of 2023 was, and January of 2024 was pretty wimpy. There was not a lot of ice that we saw, but we put the cameras back in the pilot cove this year and saw quite a bit more ice out present in the flats. So we're anxious to be able to put the cap down and see whether or not the ice really does have an effect on the cap. And the photographs here you see on the left, again, we've got somebody on their hands and knees digging for worms. And then the fellow on the right here has just pushed a sample tube down into to get sample of the sediment. So the state and federal permitting processes are significant processes, and they're important reviews of the remedies to make sure that they are protecting the natural resources. We just filed our natural resource permit application for the thin layer cap pilot on February 13th. The NERPA permits, as we call them, are issued by the Maine Department of Environmental Protection. And the permit also incorporates the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers regulations. Those permit applications are reviewed by the two lead agencies, but then also by the partner agencies. So we expect that in Maine, the Department of Marine Resources, Inland Fish and Wildlife, will be looking at at our permit application, and as well for some of the federal partners, with the Corps of Engineers at EPA. We've done site visits with representatives from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and NOAA. So it's an extensive process, and it can take months, and in the case of some permits, it can even take longer than that, up to a few years potentially. And then, of course, we've got to comply with all of the regulations. So whether those are our local state regulations around stormwater management rules, solid waste rules, the beneficial reuse are all things that we have to satisfy. And then anything that's specific to the individual communities, especially shoreland zoning permits. So this requires a lot of communication with the regulatory agencies, and as David mentioned, also a good bit of communication with the communities themselves to make sure that the public is informed and has an opportunity to, is aware of what's going on, has good information, and is able to answer questions and participate at whatever level they'd like to in the permitting processes and in our planning process. So the consent decree also provided $10 million for long-term monitoring, to monitor sediment, fish, and wildlife for 30 to 45 years, with another $10 million in contingent funding if the committed funds of 10 million are not sufficient to get us to the 30 to 45 year mark. The Remediation Trust is going to build on monitoring events that were done as part of the previous studies in 2017 and 2020. And what you see here on the left is one of the Nelson sparrows that was being banded, and then the netting for some of the mummy chugs and fish on the right. So these long-term monitoring events provide a snapshot of conditions in the estuary on 3-year intervals. And they also include sampling reference areas that are away from the estuary so that we can compare the levels within the estuary itself to an area that's far enough away that it should not have been affected by the industrial discharge into the estuary. And we, remember the food chain slide that we had at the beginning. The long-term monitoring includes surface water and the sediment itself, sampling for mercury. And then we have representatives from the different levels of the food chain. So polychaetes are some of the benthic worms. Mummy chug are small fish that are very common and kind of a prey fish, definitely the bottom of the food chain. Then we were also, we sample eel, smelt, and tomcod, the tissue, and then we band and take blood from Nelson sparrow, from red-winged blackbird, and black duck. And all of those different species are sampled at different times of the year. And again, we'll do that every 3 years for 30 to 45 years to get a feel for the conditions in the estuary and the extent to which we see evidence of recovery. So the other trust that I mentioned back under the consent decree that was formed is called the Beneficial Environmental Projects Trust. That has $20 million that is provided to offset or mitigate the potential adverse impacts from the mercury contamination. And the beneficial environmental projects are intended to be projects that would provide a tangible environmental or public benefit to do that mitigation or offset. And that is a separate trust from the remediation trust. So I guess, lastly here, the community involvement is really important to us, and we do our best to make ourselves available, like I am today, and information available to the public. We've held a few town hall meetings. Last summer, we were in Frankfurt and did a drop-in session and a town hall session. We had a meeting in Orrington the first week in February, a public informational meeting about the thin layer cap. We have a website that you see the homepage on the right there, and you probably can't read the tiny little print on the very top, but there are pages that provide further information on everything that I've talked about today. There's the background on the consent decree and the settlement agreement. We've got copies of the studies that were done, the phase 1, phase 2, and then the phase 3 engineering study. And then we also, as our documents are final, whether they're plans, reports, or what have you, we post all of those onto our resources page. And you also have the opportunity to subscribe and receive updates from the list. And for anyone that wants more information, that number that's there is my cell phone. I'm happy to take calls or emails. Christine Amrine is our community involvement coordinator, and then Cindy Brooks is our managing principal. So we're happy to hear from the community and answer questions. And I think that takes us right to where we are. I guess in closing, I'd like to just say that we really, I think I speak for everybody in the Penobscot trusts to say that it's really an honor for us to have the opportunity to do this. And I think that it's an opportunity for all of us to work together to take advantage of what's really a unique and once in a generation opportunity provided by the funding from the consent decree, to do things to enhance the recovery of the Penobscot River Estuary. It's stunning. And we appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Everyone, can we give a hand? Just amazing, amazing. David, can I go ahead, or do you want to go ahead?
Go first, Linda.
Okay, great. People are already putting questions in the chat. And first, let me just say that this is just a tremendous talk in terms of helping us see how we all need to work together, and we need to weave together different kinds of knowledge and experience if we're going to solve problems, and that's really, really very very careful to do, very important to do, and that we can learn from watching you and the kinds of things that you're doing. So one of the questions is just about sort of how are you learning about this? And it is, are there examples of successful Mercury remediation elsewhere that suggests the Penobscot project will work?
Yes, so I'm sure all these questions are great questions, but yes, there are examples in several places of both the technologies and also specific to mercury contamination. So I actually have a list of case studies that we have used. So we're trying to make the best use we can of all existing information. And, again, as we look at what's worked other places, we try to find the things that are most similar to what we're doing here. But that's why those pilots are important, is that they'll prove whether or not it does in fact work here. The Penobscot, there aren't very many rivers around that have a tidal swing of 12 to 16 feet a day. So those are some very unique circumstances.
Very interesting. Another question that they're getting moved on my screen as people add more. But here, someone asked, said, years ago, I heard that due to this contamination, people who lived near, swam in, or ate from this river developed cancer-related diseases. Will the remedies presented here also address people-related illnesses from reoccurring?
Oh, so there's a couple things to unpack there. I'm not aware of the information that you've just mentioned about cancer causing things. What we know though is that the state health department has determined, the reason they've issued the closures and the fish consumption advisories and not advisories for swimming or walking on the flats is because they've not determined the exposure to mercury to prohibit those things. So there aren't those advisories out there. But the remedies are going to help with exposure, absolutely. The capping is going to put a clean surface on the flats. And the other things are going to take time, to drop some of the fishing advisories because we've got to clean up the sediment before we can clean up the worms, before that cleans up the fish that eat the worms and so on up the food chain. So it's a long process.
And in a way, you've spoken to some of that in terms of, here's another question someone has asked is, can people currently fish and consume fish like catfish from this area? Or once this project is completed, can such fishing reoccur?
That's the hope. I mean, that really is the ultimate hope, is that the river, through actions that a lot of people have been doing, including the other Penobscot River Trust, is to restore the river over time, but it will take a while. And the thing that I would say is the state of Maine has a great website for what's currently, current advisories, and that's really the place to go look to see whether or not they've identified an advisory there.
Very, very good. Very interesting. One of the things that your talk really helped us see is how important it is that lots of disciplines work together and lots of people from different backgrounds work together. How do we make that happen?
That's a great question. I think that one of the ways that we make that happen is by things like this, where we make sure that people are aware. As the Remediation Trust, we have been very open and appreciative of the information that folks have brought to us. That's part of the benefit for us to be out in the communities. The several of the researchers from the original studies have reached out to indicate their interest. We will make the results of our reports available to folks. And, we just need to keep the lines of communication open. That's the best first step.
Thank you. One of the things that's so wonderful about your talk is you're speaking to lots of students from lots of different majors. Do you have any thoughts or advice about how majors can work together while students are learning them, or things that you'd advise from your vast experience and knowledge about how the students that we have here that are in one area might learn from others? Any thoughts? And if you don't have thoughts, that's fine.
Well, no, I do have one thought, and that is really to keep an open mind and go out and look and see what other people are doing. Because I have to tell you,
Great.
when I started in civil engineering, I did not expect to be sitting where I am right now. But I was lucky that I had other people open windows for me. You all are in a place where those windows are being opened for you. And I would say look around at what you're interested in and see how your interest and your aptitude can be applied to help somebody else's problem. Keep an open mind.
We are very lucky to have you here today to help us think about all of that, and to keep watching your presentation and thinking about, who do we want to talk to about this? How do we want to learn? How can we really make the kind of difference you're making?
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
David?
And
could I pick up on something
Yeah.
you guys were just discussing?
Yeah.
So Laura, you might not know that Linda is a social and community psychologist. And obviously, your background's somewhat different, and we have folks in the room from probably a lot of different majors. I think what I wondered is, trained as an engineer, what were some of those things you either picked up along the way that weren't part of your training, or you found people that you worked with that brought, in my case, I'm an environmental scientist, so working with Linda has been really helpful for me to kind of look more at human behavior and perceptions of risk and things like that. What are some stories for you that are like that?
Well, I would say the first one, I started out as a traditional civil engineer and did a lot of transportation work, designed a taxiway out at SeaTac Airport in Seattle, and I worked for a company that had an environmental group. And the head of the environmental group came over and said, gee, we're going to need civil engineers to design the cleanup actions that we do. And so that was one start. But then as I got into the workforce, there were opportunities by virtue of the work that I was doing to start having to expand beyond just being an engineer. And today is a good example of one of the things that I didn't think I would ever be doing in terms of public speaking and, working with regulators and everything else. So I would say that at a student level, or as you're just starting out, look beyond just what you're doing to see how it's being done in other places. And I think that we all are at a stage where we're going to have to work together with multidisciplines and multi-communities to get anything done. These things really become an overarching effort.
Yeah. So, looks like we have a couple questions. Maybe I'll just go straight. Go ahead. Go.
So you talked about with the capping that it kind of makes a blank slate in terms of the benthic invertebrate community. And you mentioned monitoring for polychaetes. As an invertebrate biologist, mostly thinking about clams and mussels and annelids and all the other invertebrates that make up a healthy assemblage. So I was wondering what your monitoring protocols are for the invertebrate assemblage and how you'll determine if it has recovered successfully.
Yeah, great question. And I think that's probably a question that has a longer answer than the time that we have. But I'd say a couple things. One is we are going to be using the SPY technology that's going to give us a view of more than just polychaetes. The polychaetes happen to be the species that were selected for the long-term monitoring. But as we monitor specifically the pilot project for the CAP, we're going to be looking for everything. And we'll use that SPY technology, and we probably, in some of the documents that we'll be posting pretty soon, we've got the performance monitoring plan and also identifying the frequencies and protocols for doing it. But the SPY is really going to be the main tool that we have to look to get an indication of whether things are coming back. And then we will be doing sampling of some of the benthic community as time goes by. But I think that probably we'll be waiting to do the first event at the pilot a year after the cap has been put down to give things a chance to settle down.
Great. Anybody else? Yeah.
This is more piggybacking off of talking about the multidisciplinary research.
Mhm.
I'm interested, I'm a environmental science student, and I'm starting to look into the workforce. And you see with a lot of these opportunities, there's areas for newer students or younger scientists to contribute something, especially because they're learning all these new things in college. How would you say you get new scientists involved with that approach or on like the entry levels?
Well, there are a couple of things that have happened. I'm not going to speak specifically to what we're doing here right now because we're just getting to the point where we're getting out and going. But in some of the past cleanup projects that I've been involved with, we have had interns that have come in, to do summer work, we can provide opportunities. I mean, one of the things that I'm happy to follow up with and come up the next time I'm in Maine is to just understand what research the university itself is doing. You know, again, for us right now, it's been a matter of sharing information to see if there are things that we can do to provide information for research that other folks have going on. But I would say that summer intern opportunities that some of the consultants and engineers have for summer help, especially when it's field season, could be an opportunity for somebody to get out and do some sampling and see how things are done.
Really great. Go ahead,
Yeah, so I'm civil engineering student, right?
speak up a little louder.
Hi, I am civil engineering student. So we actually did some field measurements in Penobscot. What we noticed from our field measurements, there is a really pretty much high currents in Orrington and Hamptons. So I'm curious, I'm not sure about what kind of properties in your thin layer cap. So can it like during this high tidal currents, can it wash away this thin layer and get it like transported to downstream of the river? And the other question is like you said then there is possibility to like dredging works going on in the downstream. So if you carried out this kind of dredging work, so it will increase the depth of the river, right? So eventually you creating a deep region of the river and it allows the tidal intrusion to river like upstream. So will that make like another impact of like sediment transport dynamic in the system, or that is two of my questions. So
Okay, well, yeah, so the first question, that one of the purposes of the hydrodynamic model, it was to evaluate the the velocities where the caps are. And you've got to remember that those intertidal flats are places where the river has deposited material in their lower velocity areas. So we don't expect there to be, we're not going to cap right at the edge and down into the river. That's one of the reasons that we're looking at capping only the top of the flat itself. That's where the velocities are the lowest. And we've seen that sand does do well at the kinds of velocities and the shear stresses that we're modeling on the surface of the flats. As far as the dredging goes, those are some of the considerations that we have in selecting where we're going to remove material. We don't want to go too deep because that is going to increase river velocity. So those are all questions that I can't answer yet, but those are going to be factors that are going to determine where we decide to remove material.
Great. So I had questions like that too, and I'm still going to follow up with you, Lauri, because I've got more I want to know about all this. But I think we're at time now. If there are people who do have things they'd like to talk to Lauri about, I don't think we know yet, Lauri, when you're headed this way, but I'm going to work with some folks here, faculty that might see if we could have you meet with some of our faculty and students.
That'd be great.
Also happy to connect you with Lauri via email. But for now, let's just thank her one last time. Great talk, Lauri.
Oh,
Great.
thanks very much. I appreciate the
Thank you.
opportunity. Thank you so much. Take care.